I have kept my father's ring on a chain around my neck for 2 decades now. It is a plain silver band, worn thin in places, with a pattern of small geometric lines cut into the surface. I was 6 when he died, so most of what I remember about him is not really memory at all. It is fragments. A laugh I couldn't describe if you asked me to. The way he used to grab a napkin at a diner and start sketching on it without even seeming to notice he was doing it. What I do remember, clearly, is the day my mother put that ring in my hand. I was 8 years old. She knelt down in front of me, opened a small wooden box she kept on her dresser, and lifted the ring out like it weighed more than it looked. Your father wore this every single day of his life, she told me. He wanted you to have it once you were old enough to understand what it meant. I remember asking her what it meant exactly, the way any 8-year-old would, expecting a simple answer she could hand me in a single sentence. She just shook her head and said that was something I'd have to figure out on my own one day, which felt like a strange thing for a mother to tell her child, and which I filed away without thinking much more about it, the way children do with the odd things adults say and never explain. I didn't understand. Not then. I strung it on a chain, tucked it under my shirt, and went years at a time without thinking about it at all. It became something I wore the way you wear your own skin, present but unnoticed, until one ordinary afternoon at work when I looked up and saw a stranger's hand and everything I believed about my life came apart at the seams. Before I get into it, I want to ask you something. Has there ever been a moment where a single detail rewrote your whole understanding of your own past? Where you learned something about a person you loved that changed the shape of everything that came before it? I'd love to hear about it in the comments once you've finished this one. And if stories about family, about promises kept across decades, about the way one small recognition can flip an entire life, are the kind of thing you come back for, go ahead and subscribe so the next one finds you. Before that day, my life had a shape I understood completely, even if it wasn't the shape I would have chosen. I grew up in a townhouse in Connecticut with a stepfather who was never unkind, exactly, just distant in the particular way of a man who married a widow and never quite figured out how to be a father to the child that came with her. My mother worked 2 jobs for most of my childhood, then one exhausting job once my stepfather's income stabilized things enough that she could scale back, and somewhere in all of that hustle, running between shifts and school pickups and dinners eaten standing over the sink, she never once sat me down and told me the truth about my father's closest friend. I used to ask her about him sometimes, in the vague way kids ask about a parent they barely remember. What was he like? Did he like music? Did he love me? She always gave me small, careful answers, the kind that told you just enough to satisfy a child's question without opening a door behind it. I moved to the city on my own at 22, chasing a design career I could only half afford to chase, and landed at Elemental Architecture as an office assistant while I tried to figure out how to turn a love of sketching floor plans into something resembling a livelihood. It wasn't glamorous work. I answered phones, ordered supplies, managed calendars, and sat in the back of client meetings taking notes nobody read twice. Most nights I came home too tired to do more than reheat something and fall asleep with a sketchbook open on my chest, half-finished ideas for rooms I had no client and no money to ever actually build. I told myself it was temporary. The way you tell yourself a lot of things when you're 26 and drowning in a stack of medical bills that seem to multiply every time you open the mailbox. That afternoon started with me running late from lunch, which, in hindsight, feels almost funny, given what it turned into. I pushed through the glass doors of our office building in Chelsea and rode the elevator up to the 4th floor, where Elemental Architecture takes up the whole level. We are a small firm, 12 of us, give or take, mostly doing high-end residential work, brownstone renovations, the occasional weekend house upstate, nothing close to what was happening that day. We were pitching for the largest project the firm had ever chased. A $50 million headquarters build for Armstrong Technologies. If we landed it, everything about the firm would change: size, reputation, the kind of work that would land on our desks after. I stepped off the elevator and nearly walked straight into Anna, our receptionist, who looked like she'd aged 5 years since I left for lunch. "Charlotte, thank God you're here," she said. "They're early." My stomach dropped straight through the floor. Armstrong? As in Christian Armstrong himself? Gregory is losing his mind back there. I dropped my bag on the nearest armchair and half ran to the conference room. Gregory, who founded the firm and normally radiated a kind of unbothered confidence, looked like a man bracing for a heart attack. Lauren, our lead architect, was clicking through slides so fast I couldn't tell if she was organizing them or just needed something to do with her hands. Tyler was on his knees under the table, fighting with the projector cable. "Charlotte," Gregory barked the second he saw me. "Water, coffee. Make sure the projector actually works this time." I moved. Glasses out, coffee started, projector tested, all inside of 3 minutes. The kind of fast that only comes from adrenaline. Anna's voice cracked through my earpiece to tell me the elevator was already climbing. Seconds later, the doors opened and 4 men stepped out. 3 of them wore the kind of dark, unremarkable suits that blend into any boardroom in the country. The fourth wore charcoal gray, and it was obvious, even to someone who doesn't know much about tailoring, that it cost more than I made in half a year. I'd looked him up after we landed the meeting, so I already had the basic facts loaded in my head before he ever said a word to me. 52 years old. MIT. Founded Armstrong Technologies 26 years earlier and built it into something worth close to $4 billion. Never married. A man who guarded his privacy the way other people guard bank accounts. None of that prepared me for what he actually looked like standing in front of me. Taller than I expected, somewhere around 6'2". Hair going salt and pepper, a face with sharp, deliberate lines to it, and dark eyes that gave you the uncomfortable sense they were cataloging everything in the room at once, including you. I'd also read that he still gave a single guest lecture at MIT every spring, unpaid, and that he'd started his first company out of a garage in Cambridge with 2 employees and a line of credit he'd nearly defaulted on twice before it finally caught. None of that had prepared me for how unremarkable he managed to seem standing in our doorway, in the specific way that only genuinely powerful people can seem unremarkable, because they've long since stopped needing to prove anything to a room the moment they enter it. "Still, Mr. Armstrong," I said, putting out my hand. "Welcome to Elemental Architecture. I'm Charlotte Pierce." "Thank you, Charlotte." I walked the 4 of them into the conference room, poured the water, made sure everyone had what they needed, and then took my seat in the corner with my laptop open, ready to type notes nobody would probably ever read again. The pitch began. Lauren walked them through our portfolio and our design philosophy, the idea that a space should feel modern without feeling cold, functional without feeling sterile. Christian listened the way a person listens when they actually intend to remember what you said. He asked sharp questions about materials, about sustainability, about structural choices, nothing performative in any of it. Tyler stood up to present the early concept for the headquarters building. 5 stories, glass and steel, open floor plans flooded with natural light. Christian nodded along, then said something that told me he'd thought harder about this building than most clients ever do. "I like the open concept," he said, "but I want quiet spaces too. Places to actually think. Not everything needs to be collaborative." "Absolutely," Lauren answered. "We can build in private offices, some quiet zones, rooms that aren't wired for constant interaction." Somewhere around the hour mark, Christian asked Lauren a question about how the firm handled changes mid-construction, and I watched Gregory's shoulders drop half an inch for the first time since I'd walked in, the way they do when you realize a hard conversation is actually going somewhere. Christian caught me glancing at the clock once and, instead of looking annoyed at the interruption, gave me the smallest nod, like he understood exactly what kind of morning everyone in that room had already had before he ever stepped off the elevator. It was such a small gesture that I almost didn't register it happening, and I certainly didn't think anything of it at the time. It was only much later that I'd look back on that nod and wonder if some part of him had already recognized something in my face, some resemblance he hadn't let himself name yet. The meeting ran 90 minutes total. By the time it wrapped, Gregory had shifted from terrified to cautiously hopeful, which for him is basically euphoria. "We'll review the proposal and get back to you within 2 weeks, Christian said, rising from his chair. Hands were shaken all around. I walked the 4 of them to the elevator. Christian was the last one in, and just before the doors closed, he turned back toward me. "Thank you, Charlotte. Just doing my job, Mr. Armstrong." The doors slid shut. For a moment, I just stood there in the empty hallway, the adrenaline of the last 2 hours draining out of me all at once, replaced by the particular kind of tired that comes after holding yourself together for people who never once noticed you were doing it. Gregory came out of the conference room a minute later, practically giddy, already talking about how he wanted to call Lauren's whole team in for a celebratory dinner before we'd even heard back officially. I told him I'd catch up in a minute and went back into the conference room to clear glasses and straighten chairs, mostly just glad for an excuse to be alone with my thoughts for 60 seconds before the rest of the office descended on me with questions, and that's when I noticed a pen sitting on the table where he'd been seated. Matte black, obviously expensive, the kind of pen that costs more than my monthly grocery bill. I picked it up and turned toward the door, already planning to leave it with Anna in case anyone came back for it. Christian Armstrong was standing in the doorway. Sorry," he said. I left my pen. I held it out to him. He crossed the room, reached out to take it, and as his hand closed around mine for half a second longer than it needed to, I saw it. A silver ring on the 4th finger of his right hand, cut with the same geometric pattern as the one hanging against my chest. My breath caught somewhere in my throat. I knew that ring. I had worn its twin around my neck for 20 years. Everything slowed down at once. My heart was suddenly loud enough that I was sure he could hear it. Without really deciding to, I reached up and pulled the chain out from under my collar. The ring swung there, dangling between us, identical in every line to the one on his hand. His eyes dropped to it and stayed there, and I watched the color drain out of his face in real time. He wasn't looking at me anymore. He was staring at the ring like it had just spoken to him. "Where did you get that?" His voice had dropped to barely a whisper. It was my father's. He looked up at me then, and what was on his face wasn't confusion exactly. It was closer to disbelief mixed with something that looked almost like fear. "Who is your father?" His name was Colin. Christian took a physical step backward, as if the name had pushed him. "Oh my God!" He pressed a hand over his mouth and shut his eyes. When he opened them again, they were wet. Charlotte Pierce. Yes, that's me. Do you know me?" "I held you when you were 3 hours old," he said. "I'm your godfather. I made a promise to your father 30 years ago, and I have spent most of my life since then trying to keep it." I don't think the floor actually moved, but it felt like it did. "I don't understand." "Your father and I were best friends," he said. "More than that. We were brothers, in every way that mattered. And I've been looking for you for 16 years. We just stood there in that empty conference room for a while. Me with a white-knuckled grip on the back of a chair, him, a stranger who happened to be a billionaire, looking at me like I was something he'd stopped believing existed. "I need to explain this properly," he finally said, "but not here. Please, let me take you somewhere we can actually talk. I'm working. I can't just walk out." "When does your shift end?" 6. "I'll wait. There's a coffee place 2 blocks south. Rowan's." I looked at the tears he hadn't quite gotten under control, and then at the ring on his finger that matched the one I'd carried against my skin since I was 8 years old. "Okay," I said, 6 o'clock. He left without saying anything else. I stood there alone for a long moment, one hand wrapped around my father's ring, trying to figure out what had just happened to my afternoon, and honestly, to my entire understanding of my own life. Christian was already seated when I got to the coffee shop, 2 lattes waiting on the table, one for each of us, as if he'd known exactly when I'd arrive. I sat down across from him. "Your father's full name was Colin James Pierce," he said, skipping past any small talk. "Born in Portland, Maine. His parents died when he was 16, and his grandmother raised him after that. He got a full scholarship to MIT. We met junior year, through the Architect Society." I stared at him for a second. I genuinely don't know what to say to any of this yet. "Just keep going." Colin was my best friend. My brother, really, in every sense that counts, because he was the only family I had. He looked down at the table. "When he died, I tried to help. I offered money, offered support, anything I could think of. Your mother wouldn't take any of it." "She never mentioned you," I said. "Not once. I'm hearing your name for the first time today." "I know." "I kept trying for 4 years after he passed. Calls, letters. She turned down every offer, and eventually she got frustrated with me for continuing to try. Then she remarried, changed her last name to Bradford, and the 2 of you moved to Connecticut." "So you gave up?" I stopped for a while, yes, I'll admit that, but I never fully let it go. I reached out here and there over the years, even after I'd told myself I should stop. Why does any of this matter now? My father is gone. He lifted his right hand and showed me the ring again, like it was evidence in a case he needed to prove. "I made a promise," he said. "December of 1994. Your father and I were 22 years old, both of us orphans, both of us essentially alone in the world. We made a pact that night. We told each other we'd never truly be alone again, that we would be brothers in every way that counted. We exchanged rings to seal it. The one I'm wearing right now belonged to Colin. He gave it to me. Give him mine." I pulled the chain out from under my shirt again and looked down at it like I was seeing it for the first time. "So this one was yours?" "Yes. Colin wore my ring for the rest of his life. You've been wearing it too without knowing what it was." The weight of that landed somewhere in my chest and stayed there. Why didn't my mother ever tell me any of this? "I don't know for certain," he said. "I think she wanted to move past the grief entirely, and reaching out to me directly, without her blessing, felt wrong to me for a long time." I stood up so fast the chair legs screeched against the floor. "Woke, I need to go." 8, please." "I don't know you," I said. I don't know why my mother never once said your name in my presence, but she had her reasons, and right now I trust the memory of her more than I trust a stranger holding up a ring. "Charlotte, please just thank you for the coffee." I walked out and didn't look back. The walk to the subway that evening felt longer than it should have. I remember passing a bakery on the corner that was closing up for the night. the owner sweeping flour off the sidewalk in front of the door, and thinking how strange it was that the entire city kept going exactly as it always did while my whole understanding of my family had just been pulled out from under me. I didn't cry on the train, which surprised me. I just sat there with my hand pressed flat against my chest, feeling the outline of the ring through my shirt, turning the same 3 questions over and over without landing on an answer to any of them. Why hadn't she told me? Why had he waited 16 years to find me in a conference room instead of somewhere easier? And why, despite every reasonable instinct telling me to be careful, did some small stubborn part of me already want to believe him? I didn't sleep that night. I lay in my tiny studio apartment out in Astoria, staring at a water stain on the ceiling. I knew by heart, turning the ring over and over between my fingers. Why would my mother have kept this from me for my entire life? Eventually I gave up on sleep altogether, got up, and pulled out the wooden box where I kept what little I had left of both my parents. Photographs, a few old letters, and, tucked at the very bottom, an envelope I had never opened, sealed, with my name written across the front in my mother's shaky, late-stage handwriting. Under my name she'd written, "When you're ready." I had never felt ready. That night, for whatever reason, I finally was. Inside was a letter and a single photograph. The photo showed 2 young men standing outside a building I assumed was on the MIT campus, both of them wearing rings on their right hands, both of them grinning like they didn't have a single worry between them. One was my father. The other, unmistakably, was a much younger Christian Armstrong. I unfolded the letter. "My dearest Charlotte," it began, "I'm writing this while I still have the strength to hold a pen. There is a lot I've been turning over lately, but one thing keeps coming back to me more than anything else, and that's the way I pushed Christian out of both our lives. Your father and Christian were best friends. Brothers, really. When your father died, Christian tried everything he could think of to help us. He offered whatever we needed. I couldn't take any of it. Every time I looked at him, I saw your father standing right there beside him, and it hurt too much to bear. So I pushed him away and kept pushing until he stopped coming back. I was wrong to do that. I was proud, and I was hurting, and I was scared, and in trying to protect myself I took you away from the one person on earth who loved your father as much as I did. The one person who could have kept his memory alive for you in a way I never could on my own. Christian adored you, Charlotte. He used to call you Little Charlie. He is your godfather. He held you the day you were born. He would carry you around on his shoulders in the backyard until you both collapsed laughing. He was buying you books before you could even hold one the right way up. He was there for every birthday, every holiday, every ordinary Sunday afternoon that turned into a barbecue because he showed up with too much food and no plans. He was family. He was our family, and I took him away from both of us. I understand now that life has moved him a long way from the boy we knew back then, and I can't reach out on his behalf anymore. What would he even think of me showing up now? I don't want him to believe, even for a second, that we want anything from him. But he has tried to find us more than once over the years. If he ever comes looking again, please, my love, give him the chance he deserves. For his sake and for yours. You don't have to be alone in this world. I love you always. Good? I read it 3 times through. Then I cried, because for the past 2 years I had genuinely believed I was completely alone, working myself to the bone in a shoebox apartment to pay off my mother's medical debt, and the entire time, someone had been out there looking for me. My mother had stolen that from both of us, out of grief she never got the chance to work through. I sat with that letter for a long time before I could bring myself to move again. I thought about all the Sundays I'd spent alone in that studio apartment, ordering the cheapest thing on the menu because I was scared to spend money on anything else, telling myself that this was simply what my life looked like now, that I had used up whatever family I was ever going to get. I thought about the nights I'd sat by my mother's hospital bed toward the end, when the ALS had taken almost everything from her except her eyes, and how she used to look at me like she was trying to say something she no longer had the strength to get out. I wondered, sitting there at 3 in the morning with that letter in my lap, if this had been it. If this had been the thing she'd been trying so hard to tell me all along, and simply ran out of time before she could. I thought, too, about all the ordinary things I'd never get to ask her now that I finally understood what she'd been carrying, whether she'd ever regretted the decision in the moment she made it, or only years later, once the anger had worn down into something closer to grief for a version of our life that never got the chance to exist. I didn't blame her, not really, not even in that first raw hour of finding out. Grief does strange things to a person's judgment, and I understood, in a way I hadn't before, that pushing Christian away hadn't been cruelty on her part. It had been a wound that never properly closed, reopening every single time she looked at the one person who could have reminded her most of what she'd lost. I understood it. That didn't make the 2 lost years feel any less like something that had been taken from me without my consent. I told exactly one person at the office what had happened, a woman named Priya who worked reception 2 days a week and had covered for me more than once when I needed to duck out early for a doctor's appointment during my mother's illness. I found her in the break room the next morning and just started talking, the whole thing spilling out in no particular order: the ring, the pen, the letter, the photograph of 2 young men grinning outside a building in Cambridge. She listened without interrupting once, and when I finally ran out of words, she just reached over and squeezed my arm. You know, she said, my grandmother used to tell me that some doors don't open until you're finally ready to walk through them. Sounds like maybe this was one of those. I thought about that a lot over the following days, turning it over the same way I'd been turning the ring over in my hand since I was 8 years old, tracing the same worn grooves in the metal without really thinking about it, a habit so old it barely registered anymore. I went to work, answered phones, made coffee for people who didn't know what to do with the version of me that kept drifting off mid-sentence, and at night I sat with the photograph and let myself imagine, just a little, what it might have been like to grow up with someone like Christian in the picture. Birthdays with an extra adult who actually paid attention, someone at my college graduation who'd known my father well enough to see him in the way I walked across that stage. It didn't make me angrier at my mother exactly, it just made the loss feel a little more specific, a little more like something with a shape to it, instead of the vague ache I'd carried around for most of my adult life without ever being able to name what exactly was missing. I looked at the photograph one more time, my father and Christian, brothers in every way that mattered, standing in front of a building that would eventually become the reason I met him again. I made a decision right there, sitting on my bed at 3 in the morning. I called in sick to work that morning, something I almost never did, and spent most of the day sitting on my fire escape with the letter and the photograph beside me, watching the street below go about its ordinary business while I tried to decide what to do with everything I now knew. Part of me wanted to call him immediately, before I could talk myself out of it. Another part of me, the part that had spent 2 years learning to expect nothing from anyone, wanted to fold the letter back up, put it in the wooden box, and pretend the whole afternoon in that conference room had never happened. I thought about what my mother had written, about how she hadn't wanted either of us to be alone in the world anymore, and by the time the sun started going down over the buildings across the street, I knew which version of myself I wanted to be. The next day I called his office. Armstrong Technologies, Mr. Armstrong's office. This is Charlotte Pierce. I need to speak with Christian Armstrong. 10 seconds passed, maybe less. Then his voice, breathless in a way I hadn't expected from someone with his level of composure. Charlotte, can we meet today after work? Same place, 6 o'clock. I'll be there. He was already at the coffee shop when I arrived. Same corner table, 2 lattes already waiting, exactly like the first time. I sat down across from him. Thank you for calling, he said. Did you talk to your mother? My mother died 2 years ago. His face changed instantly, genuine shock replacing whatever he'd been expecting me to say. Charlotte, I'm so sorry, thank you, but I found a letter she wrote to me before she passed. She explained why she pushed you away. She regretted it, deeply, and she wanted me to find you. His eyes went glassy. I never blamed her, for what it's worth. Grief pushes people into decisions they'd never make otherwise. What happened to her, if you don't mind me asking? ALS. I spent 2 years as her full-time caregiver, watching her fade a little more every week. By the time she actually died, I think I'd already grieved most of it in advance. The emptiness stayed behind regardless. I paused. After she and my stepfather divorced, it was just the two of us against the world. And then, after that, it was just me. That sounds incredibly hard. There were good days mixed in, believe it or not. She kept her sense of humor almost until the very end, even when she could only communicate through a tablet that spoke for her. She used to make the same joke every time a new nurse came through the door, something about how she'd always wanted an assistant and now she finally had one, just not under the circumstances she would have picked. I turned my cup slowly on the table, not really drinking from it. I think that's the part people don't tell you about caregiving, that you can be exhausted down to your bones and still laugh at the same joke for the 40th time because it's still her joke, and you'd rather hear it badly than not hear it at all. Christian nodded slowly, like he was filing that away somewhere. Your father had a similar streak in him. He used to say misery was fine as long as you didn't let it get the last word in a conversation. I imagine you're familiar with that particular kind of hard. You mentioned you were an orphan too, the same as my father was. I am. I grew up in the foster system. I got lucky, in a way most people in that system never do, because I had one teacher who saw something worth investing in and pushed me the rest of the way through school. She's the reason I made it to college on a full scholarship at all. She passed away a long time ago now. I'm sorry to hear that. You never married? No. I suppose I got used to being alone. I don't let people in easily, and work has always been more than willing to fill up the space where other things might have gone. About that, I said. My mother, in her letter, wanted to make it very clear that we weren't after your money. That's not what this is for either of us. Don't worry about that, Charlotte. That thought never crossed my mind. Okay, then I want to know about my father. Everything you can remember. He smiled, the first real smile I'd seen from him. I can absolutely do that. I have more stories than you'd believe. And he did. For 2 full hours he talked, and I listened to every word like it was the most important thing anyone had ever told me, because, in a way, it was. He told me how the two of them met, how my father had once talked him out of dropping out of MIT during a stretch when Christian was deep in depression and barely functioning, how they'd once stayed up 72 hours straight building a model for a class project, fueled by nothing but bad coffee and stubbornness. How my father had stood as his best man at some point I hadn't even known existed. How, the night I was born, my father had called him from the hospital crying with joy, unable to get a full sentence out. He told me about the time the two of them drove a borrowed pickup truck 14 hours to Maine and back in a single weekend, just so my father could show Christian the house he'd grown up in before his grandmother sold it. About the year they'd shared a 2-bedroom apartment above a laundromat in Cambridge, and how my father had insisted on hand-drawing a floor plan for every single piece of furniture before they bought it, down to where the lamp would sit, because he couldn't stand the idea of a room that hadn't been thought through first. About how, at their graduation, my father had given a speech nobody had asked him to give, standing up uninvited at a dinner to toast Christian, calling him the brother he'd never had and never expected to find. Christian said he still had the napkin my father used to write notes for that toast, that he kept it in a drawer in his office because he couldn't bring himself to throw it away or frame it either, like doing either one would make it too final. He used to say the best buildings disappear, Christian told me, staring into his coffee like he could see my father in it. He meant that if you did the design right, nobody would ever notice the design at all. They'd just feel comfortable, without knowing why. He said that about people too sometimes. The best kind of person disappears into how good they make you feel, instead of making you notice them doing it. He loved you more than anything on this earth, Christian said. He used to carry a photo of you around and show it to anyone who'd look. This is my daughter Charlotte. She's gonna change the world, he'd say, every single time. I don't remember his voice at all, I admitted. Just his laugh, and even that's fuzzy. He had a patient voice. Kind. He never raised it, not once in all the years I knew him. He was a problem solver by nature, always working something out in his head, and he sketched constantly. Napkins, envelopes, the margins of newspapers. He was always building something, even when there was nothing in front of him to build. I pulled out my own sketchpad and turned it to a living room concept I'd been playing with. Mid-century lines, a walnut credenza, an Eames lounge chair tucked in the corner by the window. I do the exact same thing, I said quietly. Christian looked at the page for a long moment. Charlotte, this is genuinely beautiful. Did you study design formally? I was at FIT second year when my mother got her diagnosis. I dropped out to take care of her. She died 2 years ago, and I never went back. The medical bills were too much to handle on top of tuition. I'm still paying them off, actually. Let me help with that. No, I don't want charity. That's exactly what my mother was afraid of, and I won't be the reason her fear comes true. It isn't charity, he said. It's a promise I made to your father. My father is dead. He saved my life, Charlotte. When I was at MIT, I attempted to take my own life. I was failing my classes. I had no idea how to connect with the kind of privileged kids who made up most of my program, and the one mentor I'd had just died. I had nobody. Colin found me that night. He talked me down. He made me promise, out loud, that I would keep going. I am alive today because of that promise. Helping his daughter isn't charity to me. It's the only way I know how to honor the person who gave me a future in the first place. I didn't have an answer for that. I don't need your money, I said eventually, but I wouldn't mind having someone around who actually remembers my father. Someone who makes this feel a little less lonely. Christian reached across the table and set his hand over mine. You're not alone, Charlotte. I've been looking for you this whole time, and now that I've found you, I'm not going anywhere. Over the following 3 months, Christian became a genuine fixture in my life in a way I hadn't planned for and, honestly, hadn't fully let myself want. We had coffee every Thursday without fail. He kept telling me stories, kept pulling out old photographs I'd never seen, handed over letters my father had written him decades earlier that I read slowly, more than once each, trying to hear his voice in the handwriting. He invited me out to his house in Westchester one Sunday that same month, a sprawling place with more rooms than a person could reasonably use. And I remember standing in his enormous, mostly empty kitchen thinking that for all his success, the house felt strangely unlived in, like a hotel suite someone had furnished expensively but never quite settled into. He caught me looking around and seemed almost embarrassed by it. "I know," he said before I'd even asked the question. "It doesn't feel like a home. Your father would have had opinions about that. He always said a house should look like the people living in it were actually planning on staying. Why haven't you made it feel more like yours then?" He thought about that for a second longer than I expected. I think some part of me never let myself get too comfortable anywhere after I lost him. It felt safer that way, easier to leave if I ever needed to. He handed me a plate of something off the grill and gestured toward the deck outside. Maybe that's changing now. We ate outside as the sun went down, and for the first time since the whole ordeal had started, the conversation wasn't about my father at all. He asked about my design work, about the clients I dreamed of having someday, about the tiny details I noticed in buildings that most people walked past without a second glance. It was the first time I understood that whatever this new relationship was becoming, it wasn't only about honoring the past. It was starting to be its own thing entirely, built out of two people who genuinely liked each other's company. He came by my apartment once and stood in the doorway taking in the 350-square-foot studio I'd furnished almost entirely with thrifted mid-century pieces I'd refinished myself. "You did all of this yourself?" he asked, and I could tell he actually meant the question. "It's not much," I said, half apologizing for it out of habit. "Charlotte, this is incredible. Your father always said good design was never about size or budget. It was about vision, and you clearly have it." There was a Thursday in early October, a few weeks before all of that, when I almost didn't show up to coffee at all. It had been a bad week at the office, one of those stretches where I'd spent 4 straight days fielding phone calls and photocopying contracts while watching other people do the work I actually wanted to be doing, and I'd nearly texted Christian to cancel out of sheer exhaustion. I went anyway, mostly out of habit at that point, and found him already at our table with something spread out in front of him that wasn't a photograph or a letter for once. It was a floor plan, hand-drawn, the paper gone soft and yellow at the folds. "I found this going through some boxes in storage," he said, sliding it toward me. "It's the apartment above the laundromat. Your father drew this the week we moved in. He measured every wall himself with a tape measure he borrowed from the hardware store down the block and never gave back." I ran my finger along the pencil lines, still crisp enough after 30 years that I could make out the tiny labels in the margins, notes about where the afternoon light would land depending on the season. He really thought about everything, didn't he? Everything. It used to drive me a little crazy, honestly, because I just wanted somewhere to sleep and he wanted somewhere to live. But he was usually right in the end. That apartment felt like a home in a way most of the places I've lived since never quite have, and I think it's because he refused to let it be anything less. I sat with that drawing for a long time that evening, longer than either of us said anything at all, and for the first time since the whole ordeal started, the silence between us didn't feel like something either of us needed to fill. In November, he invited me up to his office and spread out the plans for the Armstrong headquarters across a conference table. Elemental had, in fact, won the bid. "I want you to design the interiors," he said. "Christian, I'm not a designer. I'm an assistant. You're a designer who's been stuck filing other people's paperwork. I've seen your sketches. I'm hiring you. Freelance, market rate. If it goes well, maybe it becomes something more permanent. I don't even have a degree. Neither did your father. He dropped out his last semester and it never once slowed him down. Talent doesn't need a diploma standing behind it. It needs someone willing to hand it an opportunity." I was terrified, honestly, but I thought about my father, about the way Christian described him, a man who never let fear stop him from building the thing he could already see in his head. "Okay," I said, "I'll do it." A few weeks after that, Christian invited me to something he called the annual reunion of the Architect Society, class of 1994. 11 of them still met every year, he explained. Your father would have been the 12th. They want to meet you. The reunion was held in a private room near the MIT campus. I stood outside the door for a full minute before going in, smoothing down a dress I'd changed out of and back into 3 times that evening, trying to figure out what a person was supposed to wear to meet 11 strangers who had apparently loved her since before she was born. When I walked in, 11 people rose from their seats at once. Theodore Blackwood, a professor at MIT, Grace Hartley, who runs a biotech company, Julian Foster, a venture capitalist, Priya Deshmukh, a neurosurgeon, André Laurent, an architect based in Paris, Kenji Nakamura, a robotics engineer working out of Tokyo, Rachel Goldman, who argues cases in front of the Supreme Court, Omar Khalil, a clean energy entrepreneur, Sienna Rossi, a fashion designer in Milan, Dante Moretti, an astrophysicist at NASA, and Christian. Everyone, Christian said, this is Charlotte Pierce, Colin's daughter. You look just like him, Grace said, her voice already thick. You have his eyes, Theo added. His smile, too. Andre stepped forward first. Your father was the heart of our entire class. We still miss him, every single one of us, every year we get together. He talked about you constantly, Priya told me. He always said you'd end up an architect. He saw it in you before you could even walk. We could never forget him, Julian said. And now that we've found you, we're not going to forget you either. You're one of us now, whether you'd planned on that or not. Dinner ran late that night, well past the point where any of them should have gone home. Grace told a story about my father convincing the whole class to skip a mandatory review session to help her move apartments in the rain, and how he'd shown up with a tarp he'd apparently kept folded in his car for exactly this kind of emergency, because he always seemed to have the thing you needed before you knew you needed it. Kenji, who barely spoke above a murmur most of the night, surprised everyone by standing up with his glass raised and saying that Colin was the reason he'd stayed in the country at all his first year, when he'd been ready to quit the program and fly home, homesick and certain he didn't belong. Dante told me my father used to say the stars didn't care what building you put underneath them, which was either the most humbling or the most freeing thing you could tell a young architect, depending on the day you heard it. By the time dessert came around, I had a legal pad's worth of new memories that weren't technically mine, but felt like they belonged to me anyway, the way a family story belongs to everyone who was in the room when it happened, whether they were born yet or not. Rachel leaned over at one point and told me, quietly, that she still called her assistant every December to remind her to send flowers to my mother's old address, a habit she'd never managed to break even after the letters started coming back undeliverable. I didn't know what to do with that information except hold on to it. Sienna, who'd flown in from Milan just for the weekend, pulled a folded piece of paper from her bag near the end of the night and handed it to me almost shyly, which felt strange coming from a woman who designed clothes worn on runways around the world. It was a sketch my father had made of a coat, of all things, back when Sienna was struggling to break into the industry and had complained to the group about not being able to afford a portfolio piece. He'd drawn it for her on the back of a napkin at this very reunion, decades earlier, a coat she said she'd eventually built and shown to the first buyer who ever took a chance on her label. I always meant to give this back to your family somehow, she told me. I just never knew who to give it to. Now I do. Omar told me, almost as an aside while he was refilling my water glass, that my father had been the one who convinced him to leave a stable engineering job and start his own company, back when solar energy still sounded like a fringe idea to most investors in the room. He told me the safest bet in the world is the one nobody else believes in yet, because that's the only kind that actually changes anything, Omar said. I think about that more than I probably should. That night they gave me a gift. A silver ring, custom-made, engraved on the inside with the words, Charlotte Pierce, Colin's Legacy. You're part of this family now, Christian said, whether you want to be or not. I looked down at the ring, then around at the 11 people surrounding me, none of whom I'd known existed a few months earlier. I'll wear it, I told them, and I meant it completely. The interior design work for the Armstrong Technologies headquarters took 4 months from start to finish, and I worked harder during that stretch than I had ever worked at anything in my life. Mid-century modern throughout, clean lines, real materials, walnut and leather and linen chosen for how they'd age rather than how they'd photograph. There was one week, near the middle of the project, when I nearly lost my nerve entirely. A shipment of walnut paneling came in warped from humidity during transit. The lighting consultant I'd hired quit 2 weeks before the electrical rough-in was supposed to be finalized, and I sat on the floor of the half-finished lobby at 11 at night, surrounded by fabric samples, fairly convinced I'd made a catastrophic mistake accepting a project this size with no formal training to fall back on. Christian showed up unannounced that night, still in his work clothes, carrying 2 coffees he'd clearly bought from a bodega rather than anywhere fancy, the paper cups still warm enough to fog the plastic lids. He didn't offer advice. He just sat down on the floor next to me in a suit that probably wasn't built for sitting on construction dust and let me talk through the whole list of things going wrong until I ran out of things to say. Your father used to do this exact thing, he told me eventually. Sit on the floor of a half-built site at midnight, convinced the whole project was a disaster, and then show up the next morning and fix it like nothing had happened. I used to think it was a strange habit. Now I think it was just how he made peace with something before he could see it clearly again. How did he do it? Just decide it was going to be fine? No. He'd usually list out loud every single thing that could still go wrong, worse than what had already happened, until the actual problem started to sound almost manageable by comparison. Then he'd go to sleep and wake up and just start fixing things one at a time, in whatever order made sense that morning. He never pretended the fear wasn't there. He just refused to let it drive. I looked over at him, sitting there in his ruined suit trousers, coffee going cold in his hand, and felt something settle in my chest that had been unsettled since the moment I'd seen that ring on his finger months earlier. "Thank you for not telling me it's going to be fine." "It might not be," he said, "but you'll fix it anyway." That part, I'm certain of. I finished the punch list 2 weeks later on schedule and never mentioned that night to anyone else on the team. When the building was finished, Christian walked the finished floors with me in person. "Charlotte, this is a masterpiece," he said, stopping in the middle of the lobby. "This is a space where people are going to build the future. Exactly the kind of place your father would have wanted for himself." He led me to a wall near the entrance where a bronze plaque had been mounted. It read, "This building honors Colin James Pierce, Architect Society, Class of 1994. A visionary, a brother, a father. His legacy lives on in the spaces we build and the promises we keep." I couldn't get a single word out. Tears were already running down my face by the time I finished reading it. "He deserved to be remembered," Christian said quietly, standing beside me. "And now he will be." I never went back to being an assistant after that. Christian brought me onto several more projects, which led, in turn, to other clients seeking me out on their own. I finally paid off my mother's medical debt in full, moved into a one-bedroom apartment in Brooklyn with actual sunlight coming through the windows and room enough to breathe in, and went back to school part-time to finish what I'd started years earlier. And every single Thursday, without exception, I still had coffee with Christian. Some Sundays turned into barbecues at his place, sometimes just the two of us, sometimes with a handful of the Architect Society crowd stopping by uninvited the way family does. "You know," I told him one Thursday, "I spent 2 years thinking I was completely on my own in the world. Now I've got 11 godparents who text me constantly, and one extremely stubborn billionaire who keeps trying to overpay me for my own work." He laughed, the kind of laugh that came from somewhere real. "You're worth every cent of it." I reached across the table and took his hand. "Thank you for keeping your promise, for finding me." "You found me, Charlie," he said. "You walked into that conference room wearing his ring. That wasn't luck. That was your father, still looking out for both of us, in his own way." I looked down at my own hands, at the 2 rings I wear now, side by side, without conflict. The original one, the ring that had belonged to Christian and that my father had worn every day of his adult life, sits on my right hand. The Architect Society ring, made just for me, sits on my left. "Do you think he'd be proud of who I'd become?" I asked. "I know he would be," Christian said without a moment's hesitation. "You're building beautiful spaces for a living. You're carrying his legacy forward without even having to try. You are exactly who he always hoped you'd turn out to be." 3 years have gone by since that afternoon I nearly walked past a stranger in a doorway. I finished school and now run my own interior design firm, Pierce Design Studio, taking on residential and commercial projects, hotels, restaurants, office buildings, whatever comes through the door that excites me. I have a small team of 6 people who work with me, and most days I still can't quite believe that's true. My office manager, a sharp 24-year-old named Marisol who reminds me a little of myself at that age, keeps a running joke that I check every client contract 3 times over out of some inherited habit I can't explain, and I've never told her the real reason. That somewhere along the way I started thinking about the way my father used to measure a wall twice before he ever trusted a single number on paper. The first time I made payroll on my own, without anyone else's name backing the account, I sat in my car afterward for 10 minutes before I could bring myself to drive home, just letting it sink in. Christian remains my closest friend in the world. Coffee every Thursday, still, without fail, 3 years running, even on the weeks he's flying back from somewhere on the other side of the world and has to call in from an airport lounge instead of sitting across from me. He was the very first person I called after my first date with the man I'm now dating, and the two of them get along in a way that honestly makes me a little emotional if I think about it too long. Christian showed up to my 30th birthday with a gift that turned out to be the original blueprint sketches my father had drawn for the apartment above the laundromat, framed, matted, and hung already, because he said he knew I'd never actually get around to framing it myself if he left the job to me. He was right. The Architect Society adopted me fully, the way they promised they would that first night. I go to the reunion every single year now. 11 brilliant, generous people who have somehow become my family, no blood between any of us, no obligation beyond the promise a group of college friends made to each other decades before I was even born. There's a photograph on my desk at the studio, my father and Christian at MIT, young and hopeful, standing in front of a building that would one day matter more than either of them could have guessed. Beside it sits a newer photo, taken at last year's reunion, all 11 of them gathered together, and me standing right in the center like I'd always belonged there. Last spring, Christian and I drove out to Connecticut together to visit my mother's grave, something I hadn't managed to do more than once or twice in the years since she died, mostly because I could never quite face going alone. He brought flowers he'd picked out himself, nothing extravagant, just a simple bunch of white ranunculus, and he stood back a little while. I knelt down and cleared the leaves off the headstone. The cemetery was quiet in the way only small-town cemeteries are, just birdsong and the occasional car passing on the road beyond the fence, and for a while I just sat there with my hand flat against the cool stone, not saying anything at all, letting the silence do whatever work silence does in moments like that. I told her, out loud, feeling a little foolish about it at first, that I'd found him, that everything had turned out the way she'd hoped it would in that letter, even if it had taken longer than either of us would have liked. Christian didn't say much on the drive back, but somewhere around the state line he reached over and squeezed my hand once, and I understood that as clearly as if he'd said the words out loud. She did right by both of us in the end, even if it came late. I look at those two photographs some mornings before I start working, and I understand something now that took me a long time to arrive at. My father's story didn't actually end the day he died. It kept living, quietly, in a promise two orphaned young men made to each other on a cold night in December. It lived in a man who spent years looking for a little girl he'd once carried on his shoulders, simply because he'd given his word and had no intention of breaking it. It lived in 11 people who welcomed a stranger into their circle the moment they learned whose daughter she was. And it lives in me now, in every space I design, in the legacy I'm slowly building of my own, in the 2 rings I wear every single day of my life. My father died when I was 6 years old. But whatever he was, whatever he built in the short time he had, didn't die along with him. It just found a new way to keep going. Through promises that got kept. Through a family that chose each other instead of being born into it. Through a kind of love that simply refused to disappear. If you'd been standing in my shoes that day, would you have believed Christian right away when he told you he was your godfather? Or would you have needed more convincing the way I did? Let me know down in the comments. And if a story about promises that outlast decades, and about the way one small moment of recognition can rewrite an entire life, meant something to you today, go ahead and hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and turn on notifications so you don't miss whatever we bring you next. Thank you, genuinely, for watching this one all the way through.